The low hum of the diner buzzed around James Thornton as he sat in the corner booth, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. It wasn't where he expected to be on this chilly afternoon, miles away from the towering skyscrapers and the luxury of his usual world. His business trip had taken him to a small, forgotten town, a place that seemed to exist in the shadows of his fast-paced life. He glanced out of the window, watching a few locals pass by, their faces unfamiliar and indifferent. James sighed, exhaustion weighing on him. His successful real estate empire kept him busy, distracted, and numb to the emptiness that had gnawed at him for 2 decades. Today felt no different. Another day, another deal. Yet, a strange sensation tugged at him, a restlessness he couldn't quite place. As he lifted the coffee to his lips, a young man caught his eye. The boy was behind the counter, wiping down tables with mechanical efficiency. His posture, his movements, the way his brow furrowed as he concentrated. It was all so familiar, hauntingly so. James found himself frozen, his cup suspended mid-air as he stared at the young man. His heart began to race. It wasn't just the man's mannerisms. It was his face, his eyes, those deep-set, thoughtful eyes that James had seen before. On another face, a face from 20 years ago. Daniel. The name shot through his mind like a bullet, a painful reminder of the son he had lost all those years ago. James had spent 2 decades chasing the faintest traces, clinging to the hope that Daniel was still out there somewhere. But that hope had dwindled into a cold emptiness, and eventually, he had stopped searching. But now, could it be? James' hand trembled as he set the coffee down, his eyes never leaving the young man. The boy had dark hair, a slight curl to it, just like Daniel had when he was 5. His sharp jawline, the way his eyes narrowed when he concentrated, it was almost too much to bear. James blinked, shaking his head, trying to steady himself. It can't be him, he told himself. It's impossible. And yet, the young man finished wiping the tables and walked toward the register, his steps casual, unaware of the storm brewing in James' mind. He wore a simple name tag that read David, but James felt a surge of instinct, a whisper in his gut telling him otherwise. He couldn't shake the feeling, couldn't ignore the way his heart was pounding. His fingers gripped the edge of the table as he stood, his legs stiff and unsteady. James found himself moving before he could think, his feet carrying him across the diner toward the counter. His heart hammered in his chest, and every step felt heavier, as if the weight of the past 20 years pressed on him. "Excuse me," James' voice came out strained, almost a whisper. The young man, David, turned, meeting James' gaze with an expression of mild confusion. "Yeah? Can I help you?" James stood there, speechless. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. This young man could have been Daniel's twin, if Daniel had grown up. His throat tightened, and the words stuck, trapped in a swirl of disbelief and fear. I'm sorry," James stammered, running a hand through his graying hair. You look like someone I once knew." David raised an eyebrow, clearly unsure how to respond. Okay. That happened a lot." James let out a shaky breath, forcing a smile. "Not like this," he said, the faintest tremor in his voice. He glanced down at David's name tag, staring at the name as if it might change under his gaze. "David, not Daniel. Is your name really David?" James asked, his voice soft, hesitant. David blinked, a flicker of suspicion crossing his face. "Yeah," he replied slowly. "Why do you ask?" James' mind raced, questions piling up faster than he could process them. This couldn't be a coincidence. The resemblance was too uncanny, too precise. But he had no right to ask, no reason to interrogate this young man about his past. And yet, he couldn't just walk away. Not when this small spark of hope was lighting up the darkest corners of his heart. James hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "You just remind me of someone," he said again, feeling foolish. David's expression softened, but only slightly. He gave a small, polite nod. "I get that sometimes," he said, offering a casual smile, though there was a guardedness in his eyes now. "Maybe I just have one of those faces." James swallowed hard. His mind was spinning. Could it really be him? After all these years, could fate have brought him face to face with his lost son? Do you remember much about your childhood? James asked, the words spilling out before he could stop them. David's smile faltered. Why do you ask? There it was, the shift in tone, the suspicion creeping in. James realized how strange his question must have sounded, but he couldn't back down now. He had to know. Look, I'm sorry. This must sound odd, James stammered. But I lost someone, a long time ago. My son. He disappeared when he was 5 years old. The emotion crept into his voice now, unbidden and raw. And you look so much like him. David's expression hardened. I don't know what you're talking about, he said firmly. I've been here my whole life. My name is David, nothing more to it. James stared at him, desperate to believe, desperate for a sign. Are you sure? Are you sure you've never? I'm sure, David snapped, his eyes narrowing. Look, mister, I don't know what you've been through, but I'm not your son. The words hit James like a slap. He stood there, silent, the weight of the truth, or what felt like the truth, crashing down on him. He had gone too far, he realized. He had let his hope cloud his judgment. I'm sorry, James whispered, his voice hollow. He backed away slowly, his heart still pounding, but the hope that had bloomed within him began to wither. He turned and walked back to his table, leaving David standing there, shaken but composed. James sat back down, his body trembling as the enormity of the moment washed over him. He had been so sure, so certain for a brief, shining moment that he had found his son. But now, all that remained was the empty diner, and a young man with no memory of the past James so desperately wanted to reclaim. Still, as James looked back at David from across the diner, something deep inside him whispered that this wasn't over. The truth had a way of revealing itself, even if it took time. And James, after all these years, was no stranger to waiting. James Thornton sat in his hotel room, the dim light from the bedside lamp casting long shadows across the floor. His mind was racing, a storm of emotions swirling inside him. The encounter with David. No, he couldn't think of him as David. Had stirred something deep within him that refused to settle. Could he really be Daniel? Could it be possible after all these years? He stared at the small notebook in front of him, the pages blank except for one scribbled name, David. No last name, no other details. It wasn't much to go on, but it was enough to plant the seed of doubt. Or hope. James wasn't sure which anymore. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking the silence. He picked it up, recognizing the number immediately. It was his private investigator, Frank Nolan, a man James had worked with for years during the long search for Daniel. He hesitated for a moment, his thumb hovering over the screen. Was he ready to go down this road again? With a deep breath, he answered. Frank, James said, his voice taut. James, came Frank's gravelly voice on the other end. It's been a while. What's going on? James paused, collecting his thoughts. He wasn't even sure where to start. I think I may have found Daniel, he finally said, his words slow, cautious, as if saying them aloud might break the fragile hope. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. What? Frank's voice was laced with disbelief. Where? How? I was in a small town, about an hour outside the city, James began. There's a kid working at a diner there. His name is David. But Frank, he looks just like Daniel. He has to be my son. I know it sounds crazy, but you have to believe me. Frank exhaled, the sound heavy through the phone. James, it's been 20 years. You've followed leads like this before, and they've never turned out. I know, James interrupted, his tone sharper than he intended. I know what you're thinking, Frank, but this time it's different. I saw him. The way he walks, the way he talks, it's him. I feel it in my gut. Frank was quiet for a moment, weighing his words. All right, he said finally. If you're sure about this, I'll look into it. I'll need more information. Name, location, anything you've got. David, James repeated. He works at a diner on Cedar Street, near the highway. He doesn't remember anything about his past, or at least, he says he doesn't. Amnesia? Frank asked, skepticism creeping into his voice. Or something else, James muttered. I don't know, Frank, but there's more to this kid than he's letting on. Okay, Frank said. Give me a couple of days. I'll see what I can dig up. James hung up the phone, his hands trembling slightly. He had been down this road too many times before, chasing shadows, following leads that led to dead ends, and each time, the disappointment had chipped away at him. But this time, it was different. It had to be. He couldn't let go of the feeling that had gripped him the moment he saw David. It was more than a resemblance. It was an instinct, a father's instinct. James could feel it in his bones. David was Daniel. Or, at the very least, he needed to find out for sure. 2 days later, James sat in the corner booth of the diner once again, his eyes fixed on the young man behind the counter. David moved with the same casual confidence, chatting with customers and refilling coffee cups, oblivious to the turmoil raging inside the man who watched him. Frank had promised to get back to him soon, but James couldn't wait. He needed answers now. He had spent the last 2 nights lying awake, replaying the scene in his mind over and over again. What if it's him? The bell above the door chimed as more customers entered, but James barely noticed. He was lost in thought, trying to piece together the fragments of his broken family. The day Daniel disappeared had changed everything. His marriage, his career, his entire life. It had become the defining moment of his existence, and he had never fully recovered. But now, sitting just feet away, was the possibility of redemption, of healing. If David really was Daniel, it would mean he hadn't failed his son after all. Can I get you anything else? David's voice snapped James back to the present. The young man stood at the edge of the table, holding a pot of coffee, his expression polite but distant. James hesitated, his mind scrambling for something to say. Actually, I was wondering if we could talk, he said, his voice betraying the tension he felt. David frowned. About what? James leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. I know this is going to sound strange, but I need to know more about you. About where you came from. Your family. David's expression hardened instantly. Look, mister, I told you before, I don't know anything about what you're talking about. I know, James said quickly, holding up a hand in a gesture of peace. But please, just hear me out. 20 years ago, my son disappeared. He was 5 years old, and we never found him. I've been searching for him ever since. And then I came here and I saw you, and you look just like him. David's jaw tightened. I'm sorry about your son, but I'm not him. Are you sure? James pressed, the desperation creeping into his voice. Do you remember anything from your childhood? Anything at all? David took a step back, his eyes narrowing. Look, I don't know who you think I am, but I grew up in an orphanage. I don't have a family. I don't have a past. I'm not your son. The words hit James like a punch to the gut, but he refused to back down. Please, he said, his voice trembling. I don't mean to upset you, but I just need to be sure. Will you let me help you find out the truth? David's face darkened, and for a moment, James thought he might walk away. But then David sighed, setting the coffee pot down on the table with a soft clink. All right, David said, his voice quiet but firm. If it'll get you to leave me alone, I'll let you do whatever you need to do. But I'm telling you, I'm not your son. Relief flooded through James, even as the young man's words echoed in his mind. I'm not your son. He could feel the distance between them, the cold barrier that David had built around himself. But James wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Thank you, James said softly, his heart pounding. You don't know what this means to me. David gave a curt nod, already turning to leave. Just don't get your hopes up. As David walked away, James felt a flicker of hope reignite inside him. It was a small spark, fragile but alive. He had come this far, and now he was on the verge of uncovering the truth, whatever that truth might be. All he had to do was wait for Frank's call. Later that night, James sat in his hotel room, staring at his phone, willing it to ring. The wait felt endless, each second ticking by with agonizing slowness. When the phone finally buzzed, he snatched it up immediately. Frank? James' voice was breathless. Yeah, it's me, Frank replied. There was a pause, and James could feel the weight of whatever news Frank had. I've got some information. James' heart pounded in his chest. And David. His real name is David, Frank said slowly. He was found outside an orphanage when he was about 5 years old. No memory of who he was or how he got there. The records are pretty vague, but there's nothing to suggest he's anyone other than who he says he is. James felt his stomach drop. No, that can't be right. There must be more. I'm sorry, James, Frank said quietly. I've looked into everything. If he's your son, there's no evidence of it. James sank onto the bed, the phone still pressed to his ear. The hope that had kept him going, that small flicker of light, was now dimming again. Had he really been wrong all along? Thanks, Frank, James muttered, though his voice felt distant, hollow. As the line went dead, James stared at the wall, the silence of the room pressing in around him. But even as the doubts closed in, something inside him refused to let go. This wasn't over. Not yet. James sat in the cafe the next morning, staring blankly at his untouched cup of coffee. Frank's call the night before still echoed in his mind, the weight of his words pressing down on him. David had no memory of his past. No evidence tied him to Daniel. It should have been enough to make him walk away, but it wasn't. James couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. He needed answers, and there was only one person left who might provide them. His daughter, Elena. Elena had been 12 when Daniel disappeared, and his loss had devastated her. She had idolized her little brother, and for years after he vanished, she clung to hope. But as time passed and the search for Daniel grew cold, so did Elena's relationship with her father. She blamed him for focusing more on his business empire than on their family. James hadn't spoken to Elena in months, not since their last argument. She had always resented how obsessed he became with finding Daniel, believing that his search had consumed their lives and driven a wedge between them. But now, if there was any chance of bringing Daniel back, he needed her help. He picked up his phone and dialed her number. Elena answered after a few rings. Dad? Her voice was wary, clearly surprised to hear from him. Elena, I need to talk to you. It's about Daniel. A long pause followed. What is it? She finally asked, her tone clipped, as if she didn't want to get dragged back into the past. I think I've found him. Silence. Dad, don't do this again, Elena said, her voice softer now, tinged with the pain of old wounds. You've been chasing this for 20 years. It's time to let it go. I can't, James said, his voice trembling. I met a young man. He looks exactly like Daniel would now. He doesn't remember his past. But, Elena, I swear, it's him. Dad, please, Elena sighed. We've been through this. You've followed lead after lead, and every time it's led to disappointment. Do you really want to reopen that wound? I need to know, James whispered. If there's even the slightest chance that this is him, I have to try. Elena was quiet again, and for a moment, James thought she had hung up. Then she spoke, her voice resigned. All right, I'll meet you, but I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this for Daniel. That evening, James sat across from Elena at a quiet restaurant. She looked tired, worn down by years of holding on to the past. Her once vibrant brown hair was streaked with gray, her sharp blue eyes dulled by the burden she had carried since Daniel's disappearance. So, what's your plan? She asked, sipping her wine. You think this kid is Daniel. How do you prove it? James hesitated. I asked him if he would take a DNA test. Elena raised an eyebrow. And he agreed. But Frank ran some preliminary checks, and nothing turned up. It doesn't look like he has any connection to our family. Elena set her glass down, the hard look in her eyes returning. Then why are you still pushing this? I don't know, James admitted, his voice shaking, but I just have this feeling. I can't explain it. When I see him, I see Daniel. Elena sighed, leaning back in her chair. You want him to be Daniel so badly that you're not seeing clearly, Dad. You've let this obsession destroy everything around you. Mom, she couldn't take it anymore. And she stopped, the words too painful to finish. James winced. Megan, his ex-wife, had left him not long after Daniel disappeared. She couldn't handle the grief or his relentless pursuit of their lost son. And now, looking at Elena, He realized how much damage it had caused between them two. I know I haven't been the best father, James said quietly, but if there's any chance that I can bring Daniel back, don't I owe it to you, to him, to try? Elena stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she nodded. I'll come with you. Let's meet this guy. Maybe there's something there, or maybe it's just another dead end. But either way, you need closure, Dad. James felt a surge of relief. It was a small step, but at least Elena was willing to stand by him again. The next day, James and Elena drove to the diner, where David was waiting. He sat in the back, arms crossed, watching them approach with a guarded expression. Elena's face paled when she saw him. Dad, she whispered, her voice trembling. He looks just like Daniel. James swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. I told you. David stood as they approached, his eyes flicking between James and Elena. So, you brought backup? He said, his tone laced with tension. This is my daughter, Elena, James said, his voice tight. I needed her to meet you. Elena took a deep breath, stepping forward. Hi, David. Can we talk? David nodded warily. I guess. They sat down at a corner booth, the air thick with tension. James watched Elena carefully, waiting for her reaction. He could see the confusion in her eyes, the same mixture of disbelief and hope that had gripped him from the moment he saw David. I need to know, Elena began, her voice shaky. If you're our brother. If there's any chance you're Daniel. David clenched his jaw, the frustration clear on his face. I've told your father, I don't know anything about my past. I grew up in an orphanage. I'm not your brother. Elena stared at him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. Maybe not. But would you be willing to take a DNA test? Just so we can be sure. David sighed, leaning back in the booth. Fine. If it'll get you both off my back, I'll do it. James exchanged a glance with Elena, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment that could finally bring them the answers they had waited for all these years. But deep down, James couldn't shake the feeling that once they uncovered the truth, their lives would never be the same again. The DNA test results arrived faster than expected. James had spent every waking moment on edge, constantly checking his phone, waiting for the call that could change everything. When it finally came, he was sitting in his office, staring blankly at a photo of Daniel from years ago. His heart lurched when the phone buzzed on his desk. It was Frank. James. Frank's voice was low, cautious. I've got the results. James' pulse quickened, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched the phone. And there was a pause, one that felt like it stretched for an eternity. I'm sorry, James. The DNA test was negative. He's not Daniel. James' world seemed to collapse around him, the crushing weight of disappointment sinking in like a stone in his chest. For a moment, he couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. It wasn't possible. David had to be Daniel. He had to be. I see, James finally muttered, his voice barely audible. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear, Frank said, his tone sympathetic. But it's better to know the truth now, rather than hold on to false hope. James swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had been so sure. For the first time in years, he had allowed himself to believe again, to hope that Daniel was out there, that he could be brought home. And now that hope was gone. I appreciate your help, Frank, James said, trying to keep his voice steady. After hanging up, James slumped back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. His mind spun, trying to reconcile the gut feeling that David was somehow still connected to his son. But the DNA test was conclusive. It didn't lie. David wasn't Daniel. Yet, despite the evidence, something inside James refused to let go. Later that evening, James met Elena at the house. She had already heard the news, and her expression reflected the same mix of sadness and frustration he felt. They sat across from each other in the living room, the silence between them thick with disappointment. So, that's it? Elena asked softly, breaking the silence. He's not Daniel? James nodded, his jaw clenched. The test was negative. Frank's convinced there's nothing more to it. Elena stared at her father, her face unreadable. And what do you think? James let out a deep breath, rubbing his tired eyes. I don't know. I can't explain it, but something still feels off. I don't believe this is the end of the story. There's more to David than we realize. Elena raised an eyebrow. Dad, the DNA test was definitive. If he was Daniel, it would have shown that. I know, James said, frustration creeping into his voice. But there's something we're missing. I can't just walk away from this. Elena sighed, leaning back into the couch. You've been chasing ghosts for 20 years. Maybe it's time to accept that we'll never find him. James didn't respond. He knew she was right, at least on the surface. But his instincts, his father's intuition, refused to let him close the door completely. He had been wrong before, led down countless dead ends, but this time felt different. I need to talk to him one more time, James said, standing up abruptly. I need to know what really happened to him before he arrived at that orphanage. Elena shook her head. Dad, you're going to push him too far. He doesn't know anything about his past. I have to try, James replied firmly. Something's been buried here, and I need to dig it up. The next day, James found David at the diner once again, wiping down tables in the late afternoon lull. This time, David's expression was hardened, guarded. He had expected James to show up, but the tension between them was palpable. I heard the results, David said before James could speak, his voice flat. Guess you finally have your answer. James nodded, his mouth dry. Yeah, but I don't think the test is the full story. David's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? Look, I know the results say we're not related, James said quickly, but I still think there's something about your past that connects you to what happened to my son. David scoffed, tossing the towel onto the counter. You're obsessed, man. I don't know what else to tell you. I don't remember anything before the orphanage, and if I could help you, I would. But I'm not your son. Maybe not, James admitted, his voice softening. But don't you want to know who you really are? What if your past is more complicated than you think? David's jaw clenched, the frustration evident on his face. Of course I want to know, but I've spent years trying to figure it out, and I came up empty. What makes you think you'll find anything new? Because I've been searching for my son just as long, James said, his voice heavy with emotion. And I've learned that some answers don't come easy. But they're out there if you keep digging. David stared at him, conflicted. After a long pause, he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. So, what do you want from me? I want to help you, James said earnestly. Let's work together. Maybe we can find the truth about what happened to you before you ended up at the orphanage. It might not bring us the answers we're looking for, but it could get us closer. David was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded, though his eyes were still wary. All right, I'll give it one last shot. But don't expect much. James felt a surge of hope, even if it was tempered by caution. Together, they would dig deeper into David's past, and maybe, just maybe, they would finally uncover the truth that had eluded them both for so long. The next few days were filled with quiet tension as James and David worked together to uncover the truth about David's past. With Frank's help, they combed through old records from the orphanage, searching for any clue that might shed light on where David came from before he was found. James had grown increasingly restless, his instincts pushing him forward even as doubt gnawed at him. The DNA test may have ruled out a direct connection, but something still felt wrong. Every time he looked at David, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something hidden beneath the surface. One afternoon, Frank called with new information. James was at his office when the phone rang, and he answered immediately, his heart racing. I've got something, Frank said, his tone serious. It's not much, but it's a lead. James leaned forward, gripping the edge of his desk. What is it? I dug deeper into the orphanage records, Frank explained. David was found just outside the city limits, but here's the strange part. There was no record of how he got there. No one reported seeing him being dropped off, and he wasn't brought in by social services. He just appeared. James frowned. What are you saying? There's more, Frank continued. There were some vague reports of a car spotted near the orphanage around the same time David arrived, but no one could ever confirm who it belonged to. The trail went cold, and the records were buried. James sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. So, someone abandoned him there, deliberately. Looks that way, Frank said. But whoever did it covered their tracks well. This wasn't an accident. Someone didn't want anyone to know where David came from. A cold chill ran down James' spine. Someone had deliberately hidden David's past. Someone who knew more than they had ever revealed. Frank, can you find out more about the car? James asked, his voice tight. Anything, license plate, make, model? I'll keep digging, Frank replied. But this happened nearly 2 decades ago. Records are spotty. It might take some time. Do whatever it takes, James said, a new determination settling over him. I have a feeling this car is the key to finding out what really happened to David. That evening, James met David at the diner, his heart heavy with the weight of what Frank had discovered. David looked up as James entered, wiping his hands on a towel. He could sense something was different this time. You find something? David asked, sitting down across from him. James nodded, leaning forward. Frank did some digging. There were reports of a car seen near the orphanage around the time you were found. No one knows who was driving it, but someone dropped you off there on purpose. David's face hardened, his fingers tapping restlessly on the table. So someone abandoned me. That's not much of a surprise. I've always assumed that. I think there's more to it, James said cautiously. Whoever left you there didn't want to be found. They went out of their way to make sure no one knew where you came from. David stared at him, his expression unreadable. What are you saying? That I was kidnapped or something? I don't know, James admitted, but I think we're getting closer to the truth. If we can figure out who that car belonged to, we might be able to uncover what really happened to you. David leaned back, crossing his arms. And if we do? What if we find out something I don't want to know? What if my past is worse than we thought? James felt a pang of guilt. He knew he was pushing David into territory that neither of them were prepared for, but he couldn't stop now. They were too close. We won't know unless we keep going, James said quietly. But you deserve to know the truth, David. Whatever it is. David was silent for a long moment, his jaw clenched. Then, finally, he nodded. All right, let's find out who put me in that orphanage. I want to know why. 2 days later, Frank called again, and this time, his voice was grim. I tracked down an old report, Frank said. The car spotted near the orphanage was registered to someone named Samuel Hayes. He was involved in some shady dealings back then, a small-time criminal with connections to bigger players. James' heart pounded. And Hayes died years ago, but his name was tied to a bigger case, a trafficking ring that was busted in the early 2000s. His group was known for kidnapping children and selling them to illegal adoption rings. James' blood ran cold. You think David might have been one of those kids? It's possible, Frank said carefully, but we don't have proof yet. What we do know is that Hayes was active around the time David was found, and his group was moving kids around the area. James sat in stunned silence, the implications of Frank's words crashing over him like a wave. If David had been kidnapped as a child and placed into the orphanage under false pretenses, it would explain why his past had been deliberately erased. But it also meant that David had lived his entire life without knowing the truth, that he might have been taken from his real family, lost in a web of lies. Frank, we need to find out more about this trafficking ring, James said, his voice tight with urgency. I need to know if David was one of those kids. I'm on it, Frank replied. But James, if this is true, it's going to open up a whole new can of worms. You need to be ready for that. James hung up the phone, his mind reeling. He had always feared that Daniel's disappearance had been part of something darker, but now the pieces were starting to fall into place. He couldn't stop thinking about what this meant for David. If he had been stolen as a child, did that mean his real family was still out there? Or worse, had they been looking for him all this time, just as James had searched for Daniel? One thing was certain. Whatever answers lay ahead, they were darker and more complicated than James could have ever imagined. James paced the length of his living room, his mind still racing from Frank's revelation. A trafficking ring? The thought was too horrific to fully comprehend. If David had been taken by those criminals, his entire life had been a lie. And if there was even a small chance that David was part of something bigger, then they had barely scratched the surface of the truth. He grabbed his phone and texted David, "We need to talk. Now." James couldn't just leave this hanging. There was no turning back. He had to know more. They both did. David met James later that evening, this time at a quiet park, away from the noise of the diner and prying eyes. David looked tense, his shoulders rigid as he approached the bench where James sat. "You said it was urgent," David said, his voice clipped. "What's going on?" James motioned for David to sit, the gravity of the situation weighing heavily on him. He wasted no time getting to the point. "I think we've uncovered something," James said, his voice low, steady. "Frank found a connection, someone named Samuel Hayes. He was involved in a child trafficking ring, the kind that kidnaps children and erases their identities." David's face went pale, but he kept his expression locked down, trying to process what James was telling him. "What does that have to do with me?" David asked, though his voice wavered slightly. James exhaled slowly. "Hayes' car was spotted near the orphanage around the time you were found. It's possible, very possible, that you were one of the children his ring kidnapped." David stared at James, his eyes darkening with a mix of disbelief and anger. "You think I was trafficked? That I'm some stolen kid?" "It's more than just a theory," James said, careful with his words. "There are too many coincidences. The lack of records about your past, the way you just appeared at that orphanage. Someone erased your history." David stood up abruptly, pacing a few steps away. His hands clenched into fists, tension radiating from every muscle. "I don't believe this," David muttered, his voice harsh. "This is insane. You're saying I've lived my whole life based on a lie?" James stood, his heart aching for the young man. "I know this is hard to hear, but we need to consider the possibility. If you were taken as a child, then your real family could still be out there. People who have been searching for you, just like I searched for Daniel." David turned to face him, his eyes flashing with raw emotion. "What am I supposed to do with that? I can't just pretend that my entire life didn't happen." "No one's asking you to," James said softly, taking a step closer. "But don't you want to know? Don't you want to find out where you really came from?" David was silent, his face a mask of conflict. The weight of everything they had uncovered pressed down on him, and it was clear he was struggling to keep it together. Finally, David spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'm ready for this." James nodded, understanding the fear in his words. "You don't have to do this alone. I'll be here, no matter what we find." David's jaw tightened, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. But after a long pause, he nodded. "All right, let's keep digging." A few days later, Frank called with more information, details that would turn their search in an even darker direction. "James," Frank's voice was tense, the kind of tension that meant bad news was coming. "I've been looking into Samuel Hayes' connections, and I found something troubling. Hayes wasn't just running a small-time operation. He was connected to a larger network, one with ties to wealthy and powerful people. The kind of people who don't want their secrets exposed." James' heart sank. "What does that mean for us?" "It means we're getting into dangerous territory," Frank said. "The deeper you dig, the more people are going to want to keep you quiet. I don't know how far this goes, but Hayes didn't act alone. If David was taken by this ring, then the people responsible might still be out there." James gripped the phone tighter. The thought of going up against powerful criminals made his blood run cold, but he couldn't back down. He couldn't abandon David now, not when they were so close. "I don't care," James said, his voice resolute. "We're not stopping. Keep digging." Frank sighed, clearly uneasy. "All right, but be careful. If these people know we're looking into this, they could come after you. Or David." The warning hung in the air long after the call ended, but James refused to be swayed. If someone had taken David, if someone had stolen his son all those years ago, then there was nothing he wouldn't do to uncover the truth. That night, James met with David again, this time at his apartment. He explained everything Frank had uncovered, including the potential danger that now hung over them both. David listened in silence, his face set in stone as the reality of the situation sank in. When James finished, David leaned back against the wall, his arms crossed. "So, what now?" David asked, his voice edged with frustration. "Do we go to the police?" "We don't have enough proof yet," James replied, his voice tight with concern. "If we go to the police now, It could spook the people behind this. We need more information. Something solid that links Hayes and his network to your disappearance. David exhaled sharply, his hand running through his hair. This just keeps getting worse. James nodded. I know, but we're getting closer. We just need to be careful. David's eyes met James, and for the first time, James saw a flicker of trust there, buried beneath the anger and fear. We're in this together, David said finally, his voice low. Whatever happens. James felt a swell of emotion at those words. For the first time since they had started this search, it felt like David truly believed in what they were doing, that he was willing to face whatever came next. But as they prepared for the next phase of their investigation, neither of them knew just how dangerous the path ahead would become. The morning air was crisp, the sun barely cutting through the early autumn fog as James stood outside David's apartment building. They had agreed to meet Frank in the city, where he had promised to share the latest findings about the trafficking ring and Samuel Hayes' connections. As James waited for David, a knot of unease twisted in his stomach. The further they dug, the more dangerous this became. He knew that if they didn't tread carefully, they could be putting themselves, and possibly others, in harm's way. David appeared moments later, pulling his jacket tight around him, his face pale and tense. He hadn't slept well, and James could see the toll this was taking on him. But there was a determination in his eyes, a fire that hadn't been there before. Ready? James asked. David nodded, but his jaw remained clenched. Let's get this over with. They met Frank at a quiet cafe in the city, the kind of place where no one paid attention to the patrons and conversations stayed private. Frank looked older than usual, the deep lines of worry etched into his face. He waved them over to the booth where he sat, a file in front of him. Glad you both made it, Frank said, his voice low. We need to talk. James and David sat down, their eyes immediately drawn to the file on the table. Frank opened it, revealing pages of documents, photos, and names. This is what I've managed to dig up about Samuel Hayes and his connections, Frank began, sliding a photo of Hayes across the table. Hayes was a small-time crook, but he worked for some very powerful people. People who were involved in more than just trafficking. There's money laundering, bribery, and even ties to political figures. James and David exchanged uneasy glances. The web was deeper than they had imagined. What does this have to do with David? James asked, his voice tense. Frank sighed and pushed another photo toward them, this time of a man in a suit, his face severe and cold. This is Victor Lennox. He's one of the people Hayes worked for, and he's bad news. He's a billionaire with major influence, both in business and politics. Lennox's name has come up in several investigations, but nothing's ever stuck. Too many people are on his payroll. David leaned forward, frowning. And what does this guy have to do with me? Frank hesitated before answering. There's a theory, and I need you to be prepared. It's not easy to hear. David's expression tightened. Go on. Lennox had dealings in illegal adoptions, Frank continued. His group would steal children and sell them to high-paying clients, families who wanted children but didn't want to go through legal channels. It's possible that you were one of those children. David's eyes widened, a storm of emotion crossing his face. So you're saying I was sold? Frank nodded grimly. There's no hard evidence yet, but Hayes and Lennox were operating in the area around the time you were found. And from what I've uncovered, it's highly likely that your disappearance was part of one of their operations. David stood abruptly, pushing his chair back. His face flushed with anger. He took a few steps away from the table, his hands clenched into fists. I was stolen and sold like some kind of commodity? James's heart broke watching David struggle with the realization. He wanted to offer words of comfort, but there was nothing he could say that would soften the blow. We don't know for sure, James said gently. But if that's true, then we need to keep digging. We need to find out who took you and why. David's breathing was ragged as he tried to calm himself. I always thought I was abandoned. But this is worse. Frank gave him a sympathetic look. I know it's a lot to process, but if Lennox was involved, we're talking about a man with serious resources. This isn't just about you, David. There could be others, other kids who were taken like you. James felt the weight of Frank's words. If they were dealing with a man like Victor Lennox, This went far beyond their personal search. They were confronting something bigger than either of them had imagined, and it was clear that they were up against powerful forces that wouldn't hesitate to strike back if threatened. "Do we go to the police?" David asked, his voice shaking with both rage and uncertainty. Frank shook his head. "We don't have enough solid evidence yet. If we go now, we risk alerting Lennox and his people. They could destroy whatever trail we have." James stared at the documents, his mind reeling. "Then what do we do?" "We need to be careful," Frank warned. "But I think there's a way to get closer to Lennox, someone who might be able to tell us more. His name is Arthur Sloan, an old associate of Hayes and Lennox. He's retired now, out of the game, but he could know something about what happened to you, David." David nodded slowly, still processing everything. "Then let's find him." That night, David sat alone in his apartment, staring at the ceiling. The idea that he had been sold, ripped from whatever family he might have had, gnawed at him. The anger boiled inside, but so did a deep sadness. His entire life had been built on a lie, and now, as the truth began to unravel, he felt more lost than ever. He wanted to hate James for dragging him into this mess, but deep down, he knew it wasn't James' fault. They were both victims of the same horrible truth. But as much as he wanted to forget it all, he knew he couldn't. He needed answers, no matter how painful they were. The next day, they tracked down Arthur Sloan. He lived in a rundown house on the outskirts of the city, far from the life of luxury he had once enjoyed. Frank had made contact, and now James and David were sitting in Sloan's dimly lit living room, waiting for him to speak. Sloan, a man in his 60s with a lined face and weary eyes, sat across from them, his hands shaking slightly as he lit a cigarette. He eyed David carefully, as if weighing whether to speak the truth or stay silent. "You came to me about Lennox," Sloan finally said, his voice raspy. "You want to know about the kids, right?" David's stomach churned, but he nodded. "I need to know if I was one of them." Sloan took a long drag of his cigarette, exhaling slowly before speaking. "I knew Hayes. I knew what he was into. Lennox. He ran the whole operation. They took kids, cleaned up their pasts, and sold them off to families willing to pay big money. It was all about control, all about money." James leaned forward, his voice tense. "Do you know if David was one of those kids?" Sloan studied David for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "You're the right age, and you look familiar. There was a boy, 5 or 6 years old, taken from a wealthy family, I think. It was a high-profile job. Hush, hush. Hayes was involved. It could have been you." David's chest tightened. "And what happened to that boy?" Sloan shrugged. "After they took him, he disappeared into the system. New name, new life. It was like he never existed." David's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. He was on the verge of finding out the truth, but it was slipping away from him, just out of reach. Sloan looked at James and David, his expression hard. "If you're going to keep digging into this, be careful. Lennox is dangerous, and he doesn't like loose ends. If he finds out you're sniffing around, he'll make sure you disappear, just like the kids." David sat in the back seat of Frank's car as they drove away from Arthur Sloan's rundown house. His mind was spinning, every word Sloan had said echoing in his head. He had finally come face to face with the truth, or at least, the closest thing to it. He might have been taken as a child, stolen from his real family, and sold into a life he never chose. His hands trembled in his lap as the weight of the revelation pressed down on him. Beside him, James was silent, his face etched with worry. He kept glancing at David, but said nothing, knowing that this was a battle David had to fight internally first. Frank, who was driving, was the first to break the tense silence. "We need to decide what our next move is," Frank said, his voice serious. "Sloan gave us a lead, but it's thin. Lennox is still out there, and digging any deeper could get us into serious trouble." James nodded, though his thoughts were elsewhere. "If Lennox is involved in trafficking, he has to have more people tied to him, clients, partners. We need to find someone who can confirm David's connection to that ring." David stared out of the window, his fists clenched. "I don't care what happens to me," he said quietly, his voice hard. "I want to know the truth. I don't care if Lennox comes after me." James turned to him, alarmed. David, it's not that simple. Linux is dangerous. We need to be smart about this. David shook his head, his jaw tight. I've spent my whole life not knowing who I am. Now, I finally have a chance to find out. I'm not going to let fear stop me. Frank sighed, pulling the car over into an empty lot and turning around to face them. Listen, you've both got skin in the game here. But if we push too hard, too fast, Linux will see us coming. He's not the type to leave loose ends. Sloan was clear. If Linux finds out we're digging, he'll bury us. James knew Frank was right, but he could see the resolve in David's eyes. He couldn't let this go now, not when they were so close. So, what do we do? James asked, his voice low. Frank leaned back, thinking for a moment. We need leverage, something on Linux that forces him to come to us. If we can make him think we know more than we do, he'll make a move. David frowned. And how do we do that? There's a man who used to work for Linux, Frank explained. He got out before things got too dirty. Stephen Marlowe, an old associate of mine, told me about him. He'd know who Linux dealt with in the trafficking ring. If we can get to him, he might give us the leverage we need. James glanced at David, seeing the fire of determination still burning in his eyes. We need to find him. Frank managed to track down Marlowe quickly, using his connections to set up a meeting in a secluded part of the city. They met at a dilapidated warehouse late one evening, the kind of place where no one asked questions. The air was damp and cold, and the tension between them was palpable as they waited for Marlowe to show. When he finally arrived, he was exactly what James had expected: grizzled, wary, and paranoid. His eyes darted around as he approached, sizing them up. "You're the ones asking about Linux?" Marlowe said, his voice low and cautious. "You're either brave or stupid." James stepped forward. "We need information. If you know anything about his dealings with Samuel Hayes or the trafficking ring, we need to hear it." Marlowe snorted, lighting a cigarette and taking a long drag. "You have no idea what you're getting into. Linux doesn't just run businesses. He controls people. He's got judges, cops, and politicians in his pocket. If you go after him, you're painting a target on your back." "We know the risks," David said, his voice firm. "Just tell us what you know." Marlowe eyed him, exhaling smoke slowly. Hayes was Linux's lapdog, doing his dirty work. Kids were taken, families were destroyed, and Linux made a killing off it. He kept everything under the radar, and anyone who got too close ended up dead or disappeared. James felt a knot of fear tighten in his chest. This was worse than he had imagined. "And David," he asked, "was he one of the children taken?" Marlowe shrugged. "Hard to say. Linux ran hundreds of these jobs, but there was one kid I remember. Taken from a wealthy family, high profile, but it was covered up fast. Never knew what happened to him, but he was around David's age." David's breath caught. "So it could be me." "Maybe," Marlowe said, flicking his cigarette to the ground. "But if Linux finds out you're digging into his past, he'll come after you. He's got no reason to leave you alive." James felt the weight of Marlowe's warning, but it didn't deter him. "We're not backing down," he said firmly. "We need to expose him." Marlowe looked at them, shaking his head. "You're playing with fire, but I'll tell you this. If you want to take down Linux, you need evidence. Something he can't bury. Without that, you're dead men walking." The conversation left them with more questions than answers, but now they had a clear path forward. They needed solid proof of Linux's involvement, something that would force him into the open. It wouldn't be easy, but James and David were more determined than ever. As they left the warehouse, James pulled David aside, his expression serious. "This is getting dangerous, David. If Linux really is involved in all of this, we need to be careful." David nodded, though his jaw remained tight. "I know, but I'm not stopping now." James put a hand on David's shoulder, the bond between them strengthening as they faced this threat together. "Neither am I. Whatever it takes, we'll find the truth." Later that night, David sat in his apartment, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The truth he had uncovered was darker than he ever imagined, and it left him feeling hollow. The thought that he might have been taken, sold, and hidden from the world for years weighed heavily on him. But despite the fear and anger coursing through him, one thing was clear. He wasn't going to stop until he knew everything. Lennox might be dangerous, but David had something more powerful driving him now. A need for answers and a desire to reclaim the life that had been stolen from him. And no one, not even Victor Lennox, was going to stop him. The days following the meeting with Marlowe were tense. James could feel the invisible noose tightening around them, as if Victor Lennox's shadow had already fallen over their every move. David was growing restless, the weight of the past driving him deeper into obsession. James understood. He had lived with that same burden for years, haunted by the loss of his son. But now, there was more at stake than ever. They were close to the truth, but one wrong move could get them both killed. Frank had been working nonstop to gather more evidence, but everything he found only confirmed the extent of Lennox's reach. He was a man who played the game at the highest level, pulling strings that no one dared cut. Lennox's power came from fear that he could silence anyone who got too close. But James and David were beyond fear now. James sat in his office, staring at the folder in front of him. It contained everything they had on Lennox so far: documents, names, and possible links to the trafficking ring. But it wasn't enough. They needed a smoking gun, something undeniable that would tie Lennox to the illegal adoptions and make it impossible for him to wriggle free. His phone buzzed, and he saw Frank's name on the screen. "We've got something," Frank said, his voice urgent. James leaned forward, his heart racing. "What is it?" "Remember the boy Marlowe mentioned, the one taken from a wealthy family? I tracked down the family. They've been searching for their son for years, quietly, without drawing too much attention." James's pulse quickened. "And they're willing to talk," Frank said, "but they want to meet in person. They're nervous, afraid of what might happen if Lennox gets wind of this." James felt a surge of hope. This could be it, the key to everything. "Set it up," James said. "We'll be there." 2 days later, James and David found themselves standing outside a large, secluded estate just outside the city. The family they were about to meet, the Harringtons, had once been one of the most influential in the state. But after their son was taken nearly 2 decades ago, they had retreated from public life, focusing all their energy on trying to find him. As James and David walked up the path to the front door, the tension between them was palpable. This meeting could change everything, but it could also be the final dead end in a long line of disappointments. The door opened, revealing Margaret Harrington, a regal woman in her late 50s, with sharp eyes that still held traces of grief. Behind her stood her husband, Thomas, a man whose once powerful presence seemed dimmed by years of loss. "Thank you for coming," Margaret said softly, her eyes flickering toward David. There was a moment of hesitation in her gaze, as if she dared not hope for what she saw in him. "Please come in." They followed her into the sitting room, the air thick with unspoken tension. Margaret and Thomas sat down across from James and David, the silence stretching before Margaret finally spoke. "We've spent 20 years searching for our son," she said quietly, her voice trembling with the weight of her words. "And over the years, we've had many false hopes. But when your investigator called and told us about David, we felt something we hadn't felt in a long time." David shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unsure how to respond. James, sensing his discomfort, spoke up. "We believe David might have been taken as part of the same operation that took your son," James said. "We've uncovered connections to Victor Lennox, and from what we've learned, it's possible your son was involved in that same network." Margaret's eyes filled with unshed tears. "We always suspected something like that, but we could never prove it. The police said there was no evidence of foul play, and we were left to search on our own." Thomas leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "Do you really think David could be our son?" David, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. "I don't know," he said, his eyes meeting Margaret's. "But I need to find out." Margaret nodded, her eyes searching his face. "We kept records, DNA samples, everything we could think of to help us find him. We can compare them, to see if there's a match." David's breath caught. This was it, the moment that could answer the questions that had haunted him for so long. But he wasn't sure if he was ready for the answer. James reached out and placed a hand on David's shoulder. "We'll get the test done. No matter what the outcome is, We'll face it together. The next 48 hours were agonizing. The DNA test was the only thing standing between them and the truth. David had barely spoken since leaving the Harrington estate, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. He had spent his entire life not knowing where he came from, and now the answer was within reach. James, too, was struggling. He had always hoped that David was his son, Daniel, and the thought that he might not be filled him with a strange mix of relief and sorrow. If David wasn't Daniel, then James would have to confront the fact that his son was truly gone. But if David was someone else's child, then he had a new family to reunite with. 2 days later, the results came in. James sat in his office when the email from the lab arrived. His hands shook as he opened it. Match confirmed. David was the Harrington's son. James sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. David had found his family. The search was over, for him, at least. But for James, it felt like the closing of a chapter he wasn't ready to end. He called David immediately, telling him the news. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before David finally spoke, his voice choked with emotion. So, I have a family. James swallowed hard, the emotion catching in his throat. Yes, you do. David was silent for a moment. I don't know what to feel. You don't have to know right now, James said softly. Take it one step at a time. After a long pause, David's voice softened. Thank you, James, for everything. I don't think I could have done this without you. James felt a lump form in his throat, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. You're family to me too, David. That's never going to change. That evening, James sat alone in his study, staring at the photo of Daniel on his desk. The years had passed, the search for his son now a part of his past. He had done everything he could to bring Daniel home, but sometimes, the world didn't give you the answers you were looking for. But in David, James had found something else, someone who needed him, who had been lost and searching, just like he had been. And in that shared pain, they had found a way to move forward. For the first time in years, James felt a sense of peace. He didn't know what the future held, but whatever it was, he knew he wasn't alone anymore. The day David met the Harringtons for the second time was both quiet and profound. James stood off to the side, watching as David stepped through the gates of the sprawling estate, the place where he had been meant to grow up. It was a reunion 20 years in the making, and James could see the uncertainty in David's eyes as he approached the people who were his true parents. Margaret Harrington rushed forward, her arms open wide, tears already streaming down her face. Thomas followed close behind, his face tight with emotion as he tried to hold himself together. The moment David embraced his mother, a heavy silence settled over the scene. It was as though two lost souls had finally found each other after years of searching. James stood there, his heart aching but full. He had done what he had set out to do. He had helped David find his family, helped uncover the truth that had been buried for decades. It wasn't the ending James had once hoped for, but it was a resolution that brought a different kind of peace. Days passed after the reunion, and James gave David the space he needed to reconnect with the Harringtons. He knew that this was a journey David had to take on his own, and as much as it pained him, James had to accept that he was no longer the central figure in David's search for belonging. The Harringtons invited David to stay with them, to get to know the family he had been taken from all those years ago. They were patient, kind, and understanding. Everything David had dreamed of but never thought he would find. And yet, despite the overwhelming joy of finding his real family, David couldn't shake the bond he had built with James. It wasn't something he could easily walk away from. One afternoon, after days of silence, David showed up at James' house unexpectedly. His expression was thoughtful, conflicted. He had been staying with the Harringtons, getting to know them, learning about the life he had been meant to have. But there was still something unresolved in his heart. David, James said, surprised to see him at his doorstep. Come in. David stepped inside, glancing around the familiar surroundings. I needed to talk to you, he said quietly, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. James nodded, gesturing for David to sit. Of course. What's on your mind? David sat down on the couch, staring at the floor for a moment before finally meeting James' gaze. I've spent the last few days with the Harringtons, he said slowly. And they're great. They really are. They're everything I could have wanted in a family. James felt a lump form in his throat. He could sense the hesitation in David's voice, the conflict brewing beneath the surface.
But
James prompted gently. David sighed, running a hand through his hair. But I can't just pick up where we left off. It's been 20 years. I'm not the kid they lost. I've lived a whole, different life, and as much as I'm grateful to finally know the truth, it doesn't erase what's happened to me. James nodded, understanding. You've been through a lot. It's not easy to just walk into a new life and pretend the old one didn't happen. David's eyes flickered with emotion. I feel like I'm caught between two worlds. They're my family, my blood. But you've been the one helping me through this. You're the one who found me when I was lost. And I don't know how to reconcile that. James leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. David, you don't have to choose between us. Your family is your family, and they love you. But you and I, we've built something over these last few months, and that doesn't go away just because you found where you came from. David's gaze softened. You're right. I don't want to lose what we have. You won't, James said, his voice steady. I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you. They sat in silence for a few moments, the tension between them easing as the weight of the past began to lift. James could see the relief in David's eyes, the burden of feeling like he had to choose finally slipping away. Thank you, James, David said quietly, for everything. I don't think I'd be here without you. James smiled, a deep sense of pride and gratitude welling up inside him. You're family to me, David, no matter what. Over the following weeks, David continued to spend time with the Harringtons, but he also maintained his bond with James. Slowly, he began to find a balance between his new life and the one he had built on his own. The Harringtons, while eager to make up for lost time, were patient, allowing David to navigate his feelings at his own pace. James, too, found a sense of peace. Though David wasn't his son by blood, the connection they had forged during their search for the truth felt as strong as any family bond. For the first time in years, James allowed himself to let go of the past, the endless search for Daniel that had consumed him for so long. In David, he had found something different, something just as meaningful. One evening, as they sat together in James' living room, David turned to him, his expression thoughtful. I've been thinking, David said, about what comes next. James raised an eyebrow. And what have you come up with? David smiled faintly. I don't want to live in the past anymore. I've spent so much of my life wondering where I came from, and now I know. But I don't want that to define me. I want to move forward. James nodded, feeling a surge of pride for the young man who had grown so much in the short time they had known each other. What does moving forward look like for you? I'm not sure yet, David admitted. But I know I don't want to be stuck in what could have been. The Harringtons, they'll always be a part of my life now. But I need to figure out who I am outside of all of this. James smiled. That sounds like a good plan. And whatever you decide, I'll be here. You know that. David nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. I know, and I'm lucky to have you in my life. They sat together in the quiet of the evening, the weight of the past no longer pressing down on them. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, it felt like the journey wasn't about chasing ghosts or unraveling secrets. It was about building something new, something real. And together, they would move forward.